Let's get started, right? So what we're going to do today, right now, is spend a few minutes talking, where I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about the course itself. Ralph gave you sort of a 1,000-foot view. We're going to take about a 100-foot view and go through a bit of like what we'll be covering over the course of these 2 weeks. And then today, go into some ideas of computational basics. The idea is that we're not going to have a lot of time covering very important sort of fundamental content. So today, we'll try to go through things like overfitting, what's regularization, and you're going to learn these things through hands-on examples. And we're going to do this through the lens of both PCA, principal competence analysis, as well as regression. Right? That's going to be what we do in the actual hands-on session. OK. So this is the second edition of this course. It's volume 2. It's a lot of time and effort to organize this. And I want you guys to thank especially these two people, if you see them around, Mary as well as Helen. They've moved mountains to sort of book everything, get you the caterers, get you nice food. So please, please do thank them. Apart from them, Ralph, Danielle, and David and I have been sort of figuring out all the other sort of moving parts about content, getting speakers organized. And this is sort of what we're going to do this year. So this year, we have a few different external faculty joining us. We have Mariam Shinechi, who's a professor at USC, Chetan Pandarinath, who's a professor at Emory as well as Georgia Tech, and Liam Pininsky. Right? All three of them will join us in the second week of our course, where we'll go into a lot more sort of nonlinear techniques as well as more deep learning influence and ideas and tools. Accompanying them is also sort of a whole armada of people, including Gabriel Rojas-Braue and Maxwell Mellon. They're both grad students from Ann Schurston's lab at UCLA. They'll be having a session later this week where they'll talk about things like encoding models. Matt Whitebay is a postdoc at Liam Pininsky's lab. And Iman Wali is a grad student at Princeton who will be assisting Frederick Eberhard, one of our faculty. We also have Omid Sani, Dominic Misfud, as well as Frank, who many of you guys probably know. He used to be a grad student here. He's now at Berkeley. Now, accompanying our external speakers are going to be our internal speakers. James is actually here today. If you guys have any questions about coding and stuff like that, that's where you go. Tara, who's another senior grad student in Leo Proctor's lab, and Tarun, who's another grad student in Michael Dickinson's lab, will also be giving you different kinds of sessions. Tara's going to talk about hypothesis testing as well as some dimensionality reduction. Tarun's going to talk about behavior analysis. And Frederick Eberhard is a professor of philosophy who's going to talk about causality, as Ralph mentioned in the morning. So what are we going to do this through our course, right? So we've split our course up into 2 different weeks. In week 1, we're going to cover some very important foundational material and what we're going to call essential tools. These are sort of workhorse tools that you'll use irrespective of your type of data set, whether it's neural data or behavior data. And we'll kickstart our session with, as you saw with Ralph's talk today, as well as sessions by me as well as James. We will cover sort of machine learning basics and computational basics. So we sort of use this time to sort of give you a very compressed view of a lot of important concepts, things like overfitting, what's gradient descent, backpropagation, stuff like that. I'll have a session on dynamical systems tomorrow, which is also going to be important because you'll have a lot of sort of nonlinear dynamical system stuff covered later in the second week. And accompanying them, we'll have encoding and decoding models taught by Maxwell Mellon and Gabriel. They'll be talking about things like GLMs, decoding models like support vector machines. We're going to cover a lot of pre-processing of data. Daniel Wagner is going to walk us through things like kilosort and other important tools that we can use we need to use beforehand before we start talking about all these other techniques. And we're going to end this week with Tara Chari, who's going to talk about dimensionality reduction, but also a lot of important things on statistics and how to do statistics right, especially in the realm of large data sets. So this is all our foundational content. For our second week, we're going to call this sort of the frontier, and we're going to have more deep learning influence content. So we're going to start this off with Liam Pininsky and Matt Whiteway talking about state space models in neuroscience. It's a pretty broad word, but they're going to cover everything from variations of hidden Markov models to more recent nonlinear encoding models. They'll have Tarun Sharma talk about pose estimation and behavior analysis. We also have a unique day on the 18th that we call Bring Your Own Data Day. So this is the only day where you can actually bring your own data sets and apply all the different tools that you've applied until now with actual TAs walking around and helping you apply those tools. Every other day, you'll be working on data sets that we provide. So that we sort of know exactly the pain points of these data sets. So if you do have your data, please bring it on that day. If you don't have your own data on that day, we'll have some sample data sets for you to play with and some sample notebooks. But it is highly encouraged that if you have any kind of data at all, this is the day to bring it. And then we're going to talk about RNNs, or recurrent neural networks, and how they've been used to sort of understand sort of biological properties of systems by thinking of them as dynamical systems. And this is where sort of will be a continuation of tomorrow morning's lecture on dynamical systems. We're going to have a session on causal learning, which is sort of a recent deep learning influence idea that Frederick Eberhardt's been pioneering in Caltech. And we're going to end by talking about sort of what's hot in everyone's mind right now, large language models, but their applications, in fact, in neuroscience. So Chetan Padariyanath has a technique called neural data transformers, and he's going to walk us through how that's used to sort of get interesting nonlinear embeddings of your data. OK. So some information on the daily schedule. As Ralph already emphasized on this, every day we're going to follow this sort of pipeline where we have breakfast in the morning, followed by a 1-hour lecture. We're going to have a 15-minute break, followed by a philosophy and general question session. Our idea for this philosophy session, as you kind of saw today, is to sort of keep it really casual, give this as a chance for you guys to ask anything, especially some things that may be more controversial in certain fields. In the past, we've talked about debates like, do you need manifolds to understand neuroscience? Do you need nonlinear techniques and stuff like that? So we hope that it's going to be lively and also keep it very topical to what the kind of problems that people care about today. And then after lunch is where we're going to dive into specific methods. So every day you'll learn a different kind of tool or technique. And in the hands-on session, which is a sort of a big chunk of time, you'll actually apply these different techniques on a sample data set that we provide. So today you're going to do this on some example hypothalamus neural imaging data. But tomorrow and the day after, you'll sort of use different data sets to do that. This is a little different on Bring Your Own Data Day. On that day, we will not have this philosophy section, but instead we'll have 2 hands-on sessions. In the morning, we'll talk about a little bit on like data pre-processing as well as sort of things like normalization and stuff like that. And you can start playing with your own data in this next hands-on session at 11 a.m., or you can use the data sets we provide. We'll have a lecture on behavior afterwards, and then we'll end with sort of this large hands-on session so that you can apply things that you've learned onto your own data sets. OK. So really important, ask lots of questions and feel free to interrupt, right? I mean, the whole point of this is to provide people with a platform of where you don't have to be afraid about questions that you ask anything that you want to, right? Just most of the people teaching you are your colleagues and other grad students. There's no need to feel intimidated or afraid. Just ask, right? OK. Some resources. Hopefully, all of you guys know this kind of stuff, but I just want to make sure that you do know about this if you don't. We have a course website. This has day-to-day schedules and topics and content for each different day. We have a GitHub repo that if you guys haven't opened it, please check it out. You'll certainly be using it today. We have a sort of a persistent GitHub repo now that we'll be using for different years. We also have other resources. So one of the elements of this, this course is to give you guys an opportunity of actually running code. And we do this through Google Colab, which is really nice because you don't have to play with Python environments and figure out different kinds of things. If any of you guys have spent playing with Python on either Windows or Mac, it can be really hard sometimes. And this is sort of one way in which we make all of that very easy for you. It's often a lot of work for us, as Daniel Wagner is sort of figuring out right now. But it really makes the job on your end a lot more easier. And as a reminder, we have a Slack channel. Please join that if you haven't already. And we have a Bring Your Own Data Day, which is going to be on the 18th. OK. Any questions on the stuff so far? Good. OK. I'm going to spend a few minutes sort of talking about the philosophy that we're going to follow in this course, right? And to that, I'm going to talk about sort of trying to shift our mindsets to what I'm going to call the computational mindset. And this is particularly relevant if you come from a world of sort of experimental neuroscience, where we often take a lot of time thinking about different experiments. You have a lot of effort that goes into each experiment. When dealing with code, you just run things, right? And it's important to feel empowered that you can run things, and you know that it'll break, but that's fine. That's how you code. And so we're going to spend a lot of time sort of really messing around with code today, as well as the following days doing that. You'll also see many different topics at different levels of depth, right? So I'm going to talk about things like PCA and regression today, but we're not going to go to them in too much depth. James is going to take off and talk about some of those concepts tomorrow. Tara is going to cover them yet again, and we'll cover them yet again next week. And the reason we do this is because you'll see them at different levels, and you'll also see them in very different contexts and use cases. And it'll hopefully make these ideas really clear to you guys. So we'll go through them in terms of thinking about architectures, thinking about sort of functions, and then ultimately going through code. And we're also going to sort of think about how you apply a method, how you implement methods, and you'll also practice the math behind some of the methods. Especially on Tara's day, you're going to have a pen and paper exercise where you have to sort of derive certain things. You'll get a bit of flavor about how some of the math behind some of these techniques, like regression, actually works. And that's going to be really informative, right? It's going to give us some strong intuitions about how these methods work. OK. Part of the hands-on session can feel a little daunting, especially if you guys haven't coded in Python before. If you use Python, that's awesome. Please help people around you who may not be as familiar with Python, right? Some of us will struggle through this, and don't be afraid of that, right? Do not be afraid of breaking things while you code. And this is one of the things with coding that's so distinct from doing experimental neuroscience. You can run things, it'll break, you'll get like nasty errors, but that's fine. That's part of the process of becoming a better coder. When you don't know what to do, here's sort of what we recommend that you try. First, try figuring it out yourself. Google the problem, look up Stack Overflow. That's usually what most of us really do in a real-world setting. You can, if you want, you can use ChatGPT, although we don't quite recommend it because it kind of takes away a bit of the fun of coding. Ask your neighbor, debug things together. Okay, so I've asked that you guys sort of sit in pairs because one of the nice things you can do is sort of sit next to each other and then help each other. And so please help your neighbors, right? If you can't do that yet, ask the TAs, which in today's case is going to be mostly me, but in other days you'll have one or more TAs walking around. And then as a last resort, we also have a solution code and notebook in our GitHub repo. So if none of these make any sense, download the solution notebook to take a look at how we've implemented it. That's not the single way to do it. There's many different ways, especially given the sort of exhaustive list of packages available for something like Python. So take a look at the solution, and then think about how you'd want to do it. OK? All right. Something we did want to touch upon is the idea that this course is sort of not a substitute for other sort of courses at Caltech. And we're going to sort of give you some ideas of concepts, teach you a broad overview of tools, provide practical training on different tools. We're not going to go too in-depth into mathematical treatment of models, right? This is particularly true in the second week. We're going to talk about deep learning things, but we're not really going to go a lot into the math of those models because there are really good courses at Caltech. These are two examples of them. One is Learning from Data by Yasser Abu Mustafa, which if you're a CNS student here, you've probably taken. Another one is from Yisong, which is Machine Learning and Data Mining. Both of these are really good courses taught by people who know a lot of important things. And I would highly recommend that, right, as a sort of a next step if you want to go deeper into some of the things we talk about today. OK. So it's customary in most neuroscience summer courses to start with a weird acronym. And this is what we're going to start with. And it stands for, why am I not talking, right? If you guys have attended summer schools before, it's very common to sort of at some point either be overwhelmed or just stop talking and not ask really a lot of questions in the process. And whenever you do that, I want you to remember this word, which is WAINT, which is why am I not talking, right? Is it because the content's not challenging enough for you? Is it because you want some help with it? Is it because you want it to be explained a different kind of way? And in any of the situations, ask, right? Just raise your hand, ask, clarify things so that you're making the most out of this process, right? So please keep those different ideas in mind. OK. So we're going to start with sort of a broad level idea of like, why would someone take a course like this, right? So say you have some data. I'm assuming most of us have some kind of data that looks something like this. If you're from the Anderson lab, you have boatloads of stuff like this. This is an example of neural data recorded from a specific cell type in the hypothalamus. These are continuous time series data traces. These are calcium imaging traces. And simultaneously, you often also have some sense of what the animal is doing. In this case, we've annotated using different pose estimation methods. We've gotten a sense of when the animal is sniffing and when it's attacking, right? So we want to make sense of this kind of data. There's different things you can ask, right? We want to discover this brain-behavior relationship. You could ask, what are the major signals in my data? And so for that, we're going to talk about dimensionality reduction approaches. You might want to ask, what are my neurons tuned to? Are they tuned towards specific behavior? Are they tuned towards combinations of different types of behavior? And for that, we're going to talk about linear encoding models. And you could also ask, is there any information about behavior at all present in all of my data? And this is where linear decoding models come in. And sort of these three pillars are what we'll cover in week 1 in our sort of foundations and essential tools section. We'll cover some of this today. You'll cover lots of this on Wednesday with the folks from the Kirchland lab. We'll cover lots of this as well on Wednesday as well as on Friday, right? So we're going to go through these sort of very basic questions first. But you might want to ask something more complex in your data. You might want to ask something like, for example, if you have neural data, can they discover computations in an unsupervised manner? And these are where tools and techniques that derive from dynamical systems come in, right? You might ask, is the encoding of behavior, is that dynamic? At different points in time, is the encoding of a single neuron actually changing? And there's tools and techniques that take into consideration the dynamic nature of encoding. And you'll cover this actually in Liam Paninsky's talk next week. You might also ask, is there information encoded in a nonlinear fashion in your data? And you'll use more sophisticated dimensionality reduction approaches like autoencoders and transformers to get at the heart of this. And these are the kind of things we'll cover in week 2. So this is just giving you a flavor about what may be the kind of questions that you might be motivated when we get to the more sort of machine learning intense portion of our course. All right? OK. So the things we're going to cover today in this first session are go through dimensionality reduction via PCA. The real reason we're doing this is to get you guys sort of familiar with Python. If you guys aren't that familiar, this will sort of be a brute force way of making sure that you are. You'll also learn a little bit about things like data visualization, how do you plot things in Python, and so on. In part 2, we're going to talk about decoding behavior using a simple linear model. And through that, you'll discover a lot of sort of very commonly seen things in machine learning. You'll learn about what's overfitting. You'll learn about regularization, which is a method to sort of combat overfitting. And these are the kind of things that you'll learn through sort of what we call a computational basics section. OK. So let's talk a little bit about dimensionality reduction first. So this is sort of an attempt to distill down in a few slides what PCA is going to do. So say we have a system of 2 neurons. In this case, the 2 neurons are these different dots represent their different firing rates, or you could think of this as calcium activity or anything over different time points. And we want to find a way of summarizing this data. Right? Clearly, there's some sort of space here along which the data is present in. And you could, for example, find what we call a one-dimensional projection. A projection of a 2D data is simply a weighted combination of the activity of these 2 particular neurons. And the projection defines a direction in this neural state space. There's many different ways of finding this kind of projection. You could, for example, find a projection that looks something like this. And you can measure 2 different things here. One is the variance accounted for that projection. The variance intuitively here means basically the spread of the red points. The red points shows the projection of all the data points onto that one dimension, which is basically our direction here in state space. You can also ask, how well does this particular dimension reconstruct the data? And that would be the sum of all these different pink lines. And in PCA, all we're doing is we're finding a method that maximizes the variance, so maximizes the spread, while simultaneously, in fact, minimizing the reconstruction of our data, so minimizing the length of these pink lines. And it's probably very intuitive that in this particular example, the best way to do that would be some dimension that looks like this, right? So in this case, the spread of these red dots is maximal. So the variance now accounted for this dimension is very high. This represents approximately the first PC of this data. And the sum of all these pink lines would be very low as compared to the example we saw before. So the question is, how do we find those correct projections? And this gets into how we perform PCA. So we're going to first take a look at PCA through the lens of a very important idea called Eigen decomposition. So again, as we said before, we're going to go through these at different levels of depth. We're going through this at one level of depth right now. We'll talk about this again several times through this course. But in Eigen decomposition, let's consider a data matrix. All right? This matrix is of size t by n. So t here are rows, n here are columns. So t represents time points in a sort of time series neural data set, and n represents a number of neurons. So what you want to do is you want to find a projection in our data that is going to basically maximize variance, which is basically represents the spread of these pink points in our data set. And we can actually prove and show that that dimension or projection that maximizes variance is the first eigenvector of the covariance matrix of X. The covariance matrix of X here is going to be X transpose X. That's how we calculate the covariance matrix. And if you perform an Eigen decomposition, which is given by this particular equation, which in this formulation is CV equals lambda times V, you're going to get out things that can give you your principal components. Now, this equation is often showed in many different lectures as such, and you're kind of expected to sort of learn that this is what an Eigen decomposition is. We're not going to go through the derivation today, but I want to give you a bit of an intuitive sense about why this equation works and what an eigenvector is. Okay? This is really important because it really forms the basis for most ideas in dimensionality reduction, but also dynamical systems. When we talk about this tomorrow, we'll learn that one of the things that you do if you have, let's say, like an RNN, is to perform an Eigen decomposition of that weight matrix of the RNN. So it's also an essential concept to understand when you're dealing with dynamical systems and RNNs. OK, so this is one equation. Let's take a look at what this equation means, right? There's also some really good literature in sort of thinking about the eigenvalue in neuroscience, which I'll link to at the end. You can get all of this. All these slides are up on GitHub, so you can look at them and when you need to. OK, let's sort of think about what this equation means a little bit, right? An intuitive way of thinking about an eigenvector is that if you have a particular relationship like this, CV equals lambda V, there are some very specific values for this matrix V They're very special values, so that if you multiply them with the covariance matrix, it's the same as multiplying them with a scalar value. Let's see what we mean by that. So let's take a simple coordinate space, and let's take a matrix C. This is an example matrix. This is an example covariance matrix of some data set. We'll see what the data set looks like in a second. And let's now assume that there is some value v, right? Let's take an example value of v. In a two-dimensional system, v is going to be a simple column vector. And let's now perform this particular matrix operation, right? C times v. It's a very simple idea. It's going to be 3 times 1 plus minus 1 times 0. That's going to be the first particular value here, right? It's going to give you a column vector, which is going to be 3, negative 1. So let's take a look at what this vector looks like in the state space. So v was 1, 0. When I multiplied v by c, it's going to give you 3, 1, which is going to be this particular direction here. Notice that what happens when you multiply a vector with a matrix is that you deform the vector, and you often rotate the vector in a two-dimensional sense, right? Simple idea. Now let's consider a very special version of v, right? This is not an eigenvector, right? And that'll make sense in a second. Let's try a different value of v, right? 1, 1. If I multiply this by c, I'm going to get out a value 2, 2, right? And you can try doing the math yourself in your head. What does 2, 2 look like? Well, it preserves the exact direction here. All you've done is that you stretched out this particular vector, right? And so such a space, right, where you can basically multiply a vector v by c and get back a multiple of that vector is called an eigenvector of that space, right? This is sort of an intuitive, simple way of thinking about what eigenvectors are. In this case, your lambda, which is referring to the eigenvalue, which represents the importance of that eigenvector, is a simple value 2, right? Now, this is not the only eigenvector of the system. You guys have a sense of what the second eigenvector is? There's one more eigenvector in the system. It's a simple combination of two numbers. So let's try, for example, 1 minus 1, right? It's going to give us a vector that's going to be 4 minus 4. So we again have a value here, 1 minus 1. It's going to be stretched out when you pass it through C, and it's going to be another eigenvector. And notice the relationship between these two eigenvectors, right? They have this property of orthogonality. The two eigenvectors are going to be orthogonal to each other in the state space. Now, so these are all really important ideas, right? And the way that I'm trying to sort of provide this intuition is to say that this is all really by construction. We have an equation, CV equals lambda v, and we have found a very specific value of v which obeys this. And those values, those particular dimensions or vectors of v, are the eigenvectors of our system, right? They're basically vectors. If you multiply with c, you're going to get back some stretched version of v, but you're not going to change the direction of that in state space, okay? So we're going to perform exactly this when you deal with the dimensionality reduction coding set. You're going to find the covariance matrix by taking the product of the transpose of your data with itself, and then you're going to use either pre-processed packages, or you're going to try to solve and find what the different eigenvectors and eigenvalues are. Now, commonly, you often don't. So to summarize, again, you can find v's such that these different eigenvectors are orthogonal, and they define a new basis that maximizes variance in your data. So if you take a look at the data that generated this particular C that I showed you before, oops, I thought I had it. Oh, there you go. It looks like this, right? And you can see that these particular eigenvectors that we sort of intuitively came to an understanding of do account for a lot of the spread in this data, right? The most of the spread in this data is through this direction. That's why this particular eigenvalue is the highest, followed by this. OK. So in practice, we often very rarely compute v and lambda directly. Instead, we use something else called singular value decomposition, which is sort of a much more computationally efficient way of calculating the principal components of our space. Instead of performing this two-step process where we have both the covariance calculated and then the eigen decomposition of that covariance matrix, you're going to have a simple one-step process. Take your data matrix X and provide that as the product of 3 different matrices U, S, and V, right? These are very specific names. U is called the left singular vector, S are called singular values, and V is the right singular vector. There's a very simple derivation you can do to actually link both of these and think about what that relationship is. You can sort of spend some time maybe in the hands-on session thinking about this. But basically, you can get back an equation that's going to be looking like this, CV equals VS squared, which is basically another way of formulating this equation. So in this formulation, singular values are the square roots of your eigenvalues, And the right singular vectors here are nothing but your eigenvectors, right? This is all to say that there's two of these very prominent ways of calculating eigenvectors for PCA. And we're going to try both of these methods when we perform this using the actual notebooks, and you're going to see the equivalence between the two. You're going to try doing SVD. You're going to get back US and V. You're going to perform eigen decomposition by calculating the covariance matrix, and you're going to see that the exact same things are what you're going to get at the end. OK. So before we sort of go into the notebooks, it's kind of important to think about why perform dimensionality reduction in the first place. And there's sort of an interesting perspective on this from Mark Humphreys, who proposes that there's both what they call the strong and the weak principle of dimensionality reduction. The weak principle is the idea that dimensionality reduction is simply a tool for condensing your data, making sense of complex data. And the strong principle suggests that dimensionality reduction is actually a hypothesis for how neural circuits compute. The idea is that everything that you see in your data is actually composed of a linear combination of some underlying what we call latent variables or factors, and dimensionality reduction is one way of finding out what the right latent factor is. And one thing that you would intuit from this particular strong principle is that if you kept recording from more and more neurons, at some point, your number of dimensions would not keep increasing. Because at some point, you would have sampled the whole set of latent variables in your data. So you could record from 1,000 neurons or 10,000 neurons, but you'd have a similar number of latent factors as in one way if the strong principle was in fact true. But again, these are two very different perspectives, right? And these are competing perspectives, and different people have different views. We'll talk about this again tomorrow when we think about neural population dynamics, and we'll go into some sort of success stories of how the strong principle has been applied. But this is something to think about when you apply things into your data set. Are you actually making a hypothesis when you're performing dimensionality reduction? OK, so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to start by using PCA, using a pre-made library first. Basically, you'll perform PCA in a single step. Then you'll perform PCA with your own matrix operations. You'll calculate the covariance matrix, and then perform an eigen decomposition of that matrix. And then you'll use SVD. We'll compare all the three different results and see how they're all pretty much the same. Right? So with that, let's start our first session. So take a look at the dimensionality reduction notebook within DIY notebooks on day 1. Right? That's the notebook we're going to play with. We'll spend about maybe an hour trying to do this first. And then we'll continue with the second notebook. Yeah.
How do you define, when you find these eigenvectors, how do you define which one is the first component, which one is the second? How do you sort it?
So when you often perform something like PCA using like SVD, they actually come, basically through the matrix operation, they actually come sorted. So they come basically often in sort of descending order. But it's something else that you'll actually take a look at. So when you play with the notebooks, you'll see that different dimensions account for different fractions of variance, and you'll sort of plot that out, and you'll see. But it's sort of by construction that basically the first eigenvalue accounts for the most amount of variance in the data, because it's a method that basically optimizes for variance. And there's other methods out there like ICA and so on that doesn't have the same sort of strict constraint on variance. ICA, for example, looks at statistical independence. But yeah, this is just one method that looks at variance. OK. So yeah, so download the notebooks. The notebooks are over here. So open this out, and there should be a button that says Open in Colab. If you open this, it should directly take you to Colab, and you can basically start running things. Read through all the different prompts and run things. And let me know if there's any bugs or errors that you get. There shouldn't be. Again, so with this first notebook, again, as I mentioned, this is sort of a really simple introduction to Python as well, if you guys are not familiar in Python. So if you guys finish this fast, you can consider moving on to the second, but let me know. But otherwise, we'll spend about, like I said, about an hour on this.